Imagine holding a PhD, publishing a book, and having like 5 decades of lived experience in your highly specialized field, right?
Right.
And then you show up to work and you find your colleagues have actually physically rearranged the classroom furniture just to make sure there's no space for you to sit.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You are the resident expert, but you're being methodically, silently pushed out of the room.
It sounds like an absolute professional nightmare, honestly.
It really does.
But, it is actually a highly common reality for professionals who just don't fit the traditional mold, even and maybe especially in environments that publicly pride themselves on being progressive.
Well, we've got a fascinating deep dive lined up for you today, exploring exactly that paradox. We're looking at a deeply analytical, very personal article titled "The Irony of Full Inclusion: How a System Fails Its Most Vulnerable."
Yeah, it's a really compelling piece.
It is. It was written by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks. And just for those of you listening, her name is pronounced J-A-M-E, and she uses she in her pronouns.
Right, and Dr. Hoerricks provides this incredible firsthand account from the front lines of education. Specifically, her time as an RSP or Resource Specialist Program teacher. But the mechanisms she documents, the invisible ways institutions marginalize certain people, those apply to almost any modern workplace you can think of.
Exactly. So our mission today is to map out that massive gap between the corporate buzzword of inclusion and the actual lived daily reality of it.
Yeah, the gap between paper and practice.
Right. And we'll be exploring Dr. Hoerricks' perspective as an autistic trans woman navigating this space. Now, just to be totally clear up front, our role here is to act impartially as guides to her experiences.
You're not here to take political sides.
Exactly, or endorse specific viewpoints. We are simply going to unpack the reality she describes in the text for you. So, okay, let's unpack this. She works at a magnet school, right? And they use full inclusion as a core part of their official identity.
Yeah, and that magnet school label, it carries a very specific weight. It implies this foundational commitment to equity and accessibility.
Like it's baked into the brand.
Right. It signals to the community that marginalized students and staff, whether they're neurodivergent, trans, or English language learners, that they will be supported there.
But Dr. Hoerricks describes a campus where those exact individuals are heavily alienated.
She does. And to understand that contradiction, she actually centers her argument on this really powerful W.E.B. Du Bois quote. He said, "A system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect."
Oh, wow. That quote kind of shifts the entire premise, doesn't it?
Completely.
Because if we look at traditional institutional structures, they were largely designed for a very specific neurotypical gender-conforming norm.
Exactly.
So when someone outside that norm enters the system and the system pushes them to the margins, it isn't actually broken, like it's executing its original code.
That is precisely it. The institution isn't failing to be inclusive, right? It's succeeding at maintaining its historical exclusivity. Because a new policy mandate doesn't just magically rewrite the foundational DNA of a system.
Right, you can't just mandate away decades of culture.
You can't. When an administration issues an inclusion mandate, a lot of times they're really just changing the vocabulary that gets used in staff meetings.
Yeah.
They aren't instantly rewiring the entrenched habits or the power dynamics or the personal biases of the staff.
It's like a restaurant plastering this massive 100% vegan sign on their front window to attract a new demographic.
Yeah.
But behind closed doors, the kitchen staff is still cooking absolutely everything in butter out of pure habit.
That is a perfect analogy.
Right. You can change the signage, you can update the menu descriptions, but if the underlying ingredients haven't changed, you're serving the exact same meal.
Yeah, the core product remains identical.
But here's where I struggle with that idea a bit. If an administration formally adopts an inclusion policy, and they are presumably tracking metrics or overseeing the staff, shouldn't that mandate eventually force a change in the actual behavior of the people in the building?
Well, that assumes the administration is willing to enforce the spirit of the policy rather than just the letter of it.
Right. Checking boxes versus real change.
Exactly. And what Dr. Hoerricks' piece illustrates so vividly is that culture will always find ways to resist policy. The dominant culture in any institution protects itself.
And she argues that resistance becomes glaringly obvious when we look how the staff responds to actual credentialed experts, right?
Yes. When experts enter the building to implement those very changes.
Which brings us to her specific qualifications. Because Dr. Hoerricks is not just, a casual observer making subjective complaints here.
Not at all.
She brings 5 decades of lived experience. She holds 2 master's degrees, one in instructional design and another in special education.
It's a massive resume.
It really is. Plus a PhD with a dissertation focusing specifically on the attrition of autistic college students. I mean, she literally authored a book called No Place for Autism and has written nearly 1,000 articles on the subject.
Yeah, her expertise is undeniable.
And on top of all that, she holds the Autism Added Authorization on her teaching credential.
And we should briefly contextualize that autism added authorization because it is a vital detail in her story.
Yeah, explain that for us.
So this isn't just like a certificate of completion from some weekend seminar. It's an advanced, legally recognized capability. It means she is certified to adapt state curricula specifically to the cognitive and developmental needs of autistic students.
So she possesses highly specialized technical knowledge on how to redesign a learning environment.
Exactly, to make it actually accessible.
Yet, despite that towering expertise, she notes that general education, single-subject teachers frequently treat her as just another random adult on campus.
Yeah, a random adult. That's the exact phrasing.
They view her presence in their classrooms not as a critical resource for their students, but basically as a direct intrusion on their authority.
Because utilizing her expertise would actually require those teachers to fundamentally change how they operate.
Right, they'd have to do things differently.
Exactly. Single-subject teachers are typically trained to deliver specific content like, say, algebra or history in a very standardized way. So when an inclusion expert steps in and says, hey, we need to redesign how this information is presented, the existing staff feels like their traditional methods are being threatened.
So sidelining the expert is just a defense mechanism to preserve their established routines.
Yeah, it's easier than adapting.
She actually shares a pretty shocking anecdote about this friction. Early on, she was attempting to deliver legally mandated IEP services to a student in a co-taught classroom. And a colleague actually yelled at her for it.
Yeah, literally yelled at her.
She notes it was the first time she had been yelled at by an adult since her college football days.
Which is just wild in a professional setting.
Totally. And the colleague's justification was that the student didn't actually need the mandated support. They claimed the student just needed a little nudge every now and then.
What's fascinating here is the distinction Dr. Hoerricks draws between true inclusion and old-school mainstreaming.
Right, which are very different concepts.
Completely different. What that yelling colleague is advocating for is mainstreaming. That's the outdated practice where students with disabilities are physically placed in general education classrooms, but the burden of adaptation falls entirely on the student. The teachers refuse to adapt their rigid program. They just expect the diverse learner to figure out how to conform to it.
It's like they drop a student who needs a ramp at the bottom of a staircase and say, congratulations, you're fully included. Now start climbing.
Yes.
And then when the expert tries to build the ramp, the staff yells at her.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. True inclusion means the environment itself flexes.
The environment adapts.
Right. The teaching methods change to meet the student where they are. Mainstreaming just creates this visual illusion of inclusion for the school's public relations while keeping all the pressure on the marginalized individual.
You know, if you've ever worked in a corporate setting trying to roll out a new software or workflow, you've probably seen a version of this.
Oh, absolutely.
People will fight tooth and nail to keep their old spreadsheets, even if the new system is demonstrably better.
Change is hard for any institution.
Right. But now imagine that level of territorial resistance, but applied to human rights and educational access. It makes you wonder, why would an institution go out of its way to hire a literal PhD expert on autism only to sideline her when she tries to do her job?
Because the institution wants the prestige of having her on the roster without having to do the uncomfortable work of actually listening to her.
Oh, that makes sense.
The presence of the expert acts as a shield. The administration can point to her resume and say, look how inclusive we are. You know, we hired Dr. Hoerricks.
Yeah, they get the credit.
Right. But when her actual recommendations challenge the comfort of the majority, the system quietly allows that majority to overrule her.
And what Dr. Hoerricks points out is that this demand for conformity, this intense rigidity, it extends way beyond lesson plans.
Yeah, it permeates everything.
It bleeds into how the school attempts to control physical presence and human identity itself. The text moves into this deep analysis of the school's strict dress code and what she identifies as an underlying purity culture on campus.
Yeah, and dress codes in educational settings, they are rarely just about clothing.
Right.
Historically, they function as a mechanism to enforce behavioral and cultural conformity.
Hmm.
Dr. Hoerricks details how this specific dress code operates under the guise of modesty, but in practice, it's disproportionately weaponized to police female bodies.
And the culture of surveillance this creates is deeply toxic. She talks about overhearing colleagues making disgusting, degrading comments about students' bodies in relation to these modesty guidelines.
And it's awful.
It wasn't about fostering a respectful environment at all. It was about asserting control and shaming individuals who stepped outside a very narrow traditional aesthetic.
And you have to remember, for a staff member who is navigating her own transition, that environment is inherently dangerous.
I can only imagine.
Dr. Hoerricks reveals that before she came out publicly as a trans woman, she listened to her colleagues say terrible, openly discriminatory things about the school's trans students.
Wow. Hearing the adults in the room speak that way.
It actively delayed her own transition. She understood perfectly well how little regard they actually had for diversity once, the HR training was over.
Let's consider the psychological weight of that for a second. You are in an environment that loudly advertises itself as a safe space.
Right.
But you're privately watching the people in power tear down anyone who is vulnerable. She mentions she constantly worried if people were glaring at her changing body with the same judgmental eyes they directed at the students.
It's exhausting.
It is. She brings in a quote from Jane Austen to capture this isolation. She says, "And sometimes I have kept my feelings to myself because I could find no language to describe them."
And that inability to find the language is a direct result of how institutions weaponize their own buzzwords.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the school's outward adoption of inclusion terminology effectively gaslights the marginalized people within it. When the official messaging constantly tells you that you are in a supportive, equitable environment, it becomes incredibly difficult to articulate the ambient hostility you are actually experiencing.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's like trying to report a fire to HR, but HR just keeps pointing to a giant banner on the wall that says 100% fire-free zone.
Exactly.
Because the banner exists, they treat you as if you are just imagining the smoke. The institution's self-image makes your lived reality impossible for them to process.
And that institutional gaslighting takes an immense toll on a person. But what is striking about Dr. Hoerricks' account is that this friction didn't culminate in some massive cinematic confrontation.
Right, there wasn't a huge blow-up.
No. As we move into the June 2026 update of her text, she describes the subsequent school year. And it wasn't defined by open hostility or people yelling in classrooms anymore. It was defined by ambiguity.
Ambiguity as a deliberate tactic. She lists this whole series of microactions. Meeting invites that mysteriously fail to reach her inbox.
Right.
Decisions about her students being finalized before she has even asked for input. And, as we mentioned earlier, arriving to co-teach a class only to find the other teacher has completely refused to co-plan and has arranged the physical furniture so there's literally no space for her to work.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Dr. Hoerricks is really mapping out the hidden, modern architecture of institutional exclusion.
The hidden architecture.
Yeah. Workplace marginalization today rarely looks like a cartoon villain twirling a mustache. It arrives dressed up as standard professionalism.
Right. They use HR language against you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When she raises a concern about being sidelined, the system uses polite, bureaucratic language to dismiss it. They label a situation a personality conflict or a communication issue, or they just chalk it up to different teaching styles.
But surely there's a practical limit to what an administration can oversee, right? Like an HR department can't realistically police every passive-aggressive sigh, every rearranged desk, or every dropped email in a building full of hundreds of teachers.
No, of course not.
So aren't some of these things just normal, everyday workplace frictions? How do we distinguish between an honest mistake and systemic bullying?
Well, that is the exact defense the system relies on. Plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability.
Right. Any single incident, a missed email, a moved desk, it can always be explained away as an honest mistake.
Sure.
But the distinguishing factor is the pattern and the impact. The system protects itself by insisting on viewing every single incident in total isolation.
No, the email just went to spam.
Oh, I forgot to pull up a chair.
Exactly. But the person living through it, Dr. Hoerricks, experiences the continuous, unbroken pattern of those mistakes.
Yeah.
And all of those mistakes conveniently achieve the exact same goal, which is keeping her out of the process. It's the death by 1,000 paper cuts. And every time you bleed, HR asks if you're absolutely sure you didn't just accidentally cut yourself.
Yes.
We have to look at why this specific brand of soft exclusion is uniquely devastating to the demographic she belongs to. For autistic professionals, who often rely on explicit agreements, clear directives, and direct communication,
Yes, very direct.
navigating an environment built entirely on unspoken subtext and passive aggression is exhausting.
And autistic individuals are also highly adept at pattern recognition.
Oh, that's a great point.
They see the systemic exclusion happening very clearly. But because the exclusion is administered through this polite ambiguity, it's nearly impossible to contest through formal channels.
Right.
You cannot file a formal grievance over a colleague's consistently shifted tone of voice or their sudden preference for closing a door that always used to be open.
You'd sound crazy trying to report that.
Yeah.
And for trans employees, she notes that this ambiguity forces them to carry the entire burden of proof.
Yeah, the burden is completely on them.
They are constantly put in a position where they have to prove that a slight was intentional, rather than the institution taking responsibility for an environment that continually produces discriminatory outcomes.
Because the system makes collaboration entirely conditional.
Conditional on what?
It signals to marginalized staff that their professional credibility and their right to participate are contingent on how comfortably they can assimilate into the existing neurotypical gender-conforming hierarchy.
So if you don't fit in, you're out.
Right. If they make the majority uncomfortable by simply existing or by asserting their expertise, the system just uses polite procedures to silently wall them off.
That leads to a massive structural problem for anyone trying to survive in these spaces.
It does.
If the bullying is completely invisible, right? If it's successfully hidden behind the shield of plausible deniability and all these polite HR buzzwords, how can an employee ever successfully fight back against it without looking like they are the one creating the problem?
That is the core tragedy outlined in the 2026 update. When informal power, like the social cliques, the unspoken biases, the entrenched habits, when that decides the daily outcome, formal inclusion policies are practically useless.
They're just pieces of paper.
Exactly. The only way to fight back is to expose the pattern itself. And that is exactly what Dr. Hoerricks is doing by writing this analytical piece.
She's pulling back the curtain.
She is providing the vocabulary to describe the invisible architecture of that exclusion, but she openly acknowledges that it is a brutal, exhausting battle.
Because the subtlety of the harm is the very mechanism that allows it to continue unchecked.
Precisely.
So what does this all mean? We've journeyed from the high-minded promises of a magnet school's inclusion mandate down into the granular reality of ignored expertise,
Yeah.
the weaponization of purity culture, and the slow, quiet erosion of a professional standing through polite ambiguity.
If there is a core takeaway here for anyone analyzing institutional behavior, it is that inclusion is not a document you draft, it is an environment you actively build. Dr. Hoerricks' experience serves as a clear warning. You cannot simply invite marginalized people into a space that was historically designed to exclude them, change the name of the building, and declare victory.
You actually have to change the culture.
True inclusion requires aggressively dismantling the invisible conditions that demand conformity.
It means that a person's credibility and their right to do the job they were literally hired to do should never be contingent on their ability to mask their neurodivergence or suppress their identity just to keep the dominant culture comfortable.
Exactly. Until an institution is willing to confront how its informal power actually operates and how its legacy staff routinely bypasses official policy, well, all the diversity and inclusion statements in the world are functionally meaningless.
They're just a public relations exercise masking an exclusionary reality.
100%.
I want to connect this directly back to you, the listener. Take a moment to think about your own workplace.
Yeah, think about your own daily environment.
Whether you operate in a massive corporate office, a tech startup, a hospital, or a local school, every single organization has a gap between the official employee handbook and the lived reality on the floor.
Always.
Dr. Hoerricks is challenging us to look critically at who actually holds the informal power around us.
It requires asking some really uncomfortable questions. Who is allowed to be the unquestioned expert in the room?
Right.
Who is subtly, consistently sidelined during important collaborative moments? When communication breaks down, who gets the benefit of the doubt and who immediately gets labeled as having a personality conflict?
Once you start looking for that pattern of ambiguity, I promise you will start seeing it everywhere.
You really will.
Which leaves me with a final lingering thought for you to chew on today. It's something that isn't explicitly answered in Dr. Hoerricks' text, but it feels like the inevitable next question.
Okay.
If a system's soft exclusion relies entirely on ordinary procedures and ordinary people just going along with a polite, comfortable status quo, does achieving true inclusion require us to completely dismantle our traditional definitions of what professionalism even looks like and just start over from scratch?
Oh, wow. That is the ultimate challenge, because if the underlying blueprint is flawed, you cannot fix the building by just moving the furniture around.
No.
You eventually have to tear up the foundation.
Because right now, too many highly qualified, deeply necessary people are walking into buildings that promise open doors, only to find themselves permanently trapped in the hallway. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Dr. Jaime Hoerricks' profound perspective. We will be back next time to unpack another fascinating set of sources with you. Take care.